At 35, Empress Elizabeth of Russia, still unmarried, faced a massive political crisis. Unable to bear children, she knew that without an heir, rebellion was inevitable. To secure the country's future, she had no choice but to groom her only nephew, Peter, as the future Tsar. But this boy, grandson of Peter the Great in name only, had none of his ancestors' spirit. He spent his days either playing with dogs or fooling around with his violin, acting downright odd. The first time Elizabeth laid eyes on Peter, she knew he'd never be the great Tsar his father was, and she was deeply disappointed. Worst of all, as Russia's heir apparent, Peter had zero connection to the country. He outright hated it, calling it a backwater, and was crazy about German culture instead. King Frederick loved showing up at important events with his dog, so Peter copied him, strutting into the Empress's presence with his pet, blatantly challenging her authority. Even after being warned not to bring the dog, Peter didn't get it. He even had the nerve to say that once he became Tsar, he'd change how Russians lived. No one in their right mind would say that while the current Tsar was still alive. Peter's stupidity and ignorance pushed Elizabeth over the edge. Just like that, Peter was out of the running, but he didn't have a clue. The Empress called an emergency meeting right away to pick a wife for Peter with her ministers. The ministers, driven by their own agendas, recommended European princesses under the guise of forming alliances for Russia's future, all to serve their own interests. The more Elizabeth listened, the angrier she got. She couldn't fathom why these guys thought marrying a princess automatically meant a friendship with her country. Diplomatically speaking, those so-called alliance plans offered Russia zero real security. Besides, in her view, Peter's future wife had one job: to produce a worthy heir, plain and simple. Peter, clueless as ever, didn't catch his aunt's drift. He started browsing the portraits of princesses the maids showed him, picking with relish. He daydreamed about marrying a girl he liked, having a bunch of cute kids, and finally having a real family of his own. Before long, he settled on the Polish princess, who looked the prettiest. He took her portrait straight to his aunt, saying she was the one he wanted.
А прусская принцесса тебе не нравится?
Нет.
Но это же твоя родная кровь.
Нет, я хочу польскую.
Turns out, Empress Elizabeth already had someone in mind, Princess Sophia, daughter of her late fiancé Karl August's sister. Her fiancé, who died of a sudden illness just before their wedding, held a special place in her heart. Having Peter marry his relative felt like a way to heal that old wound. The stubborn Peter didn't see it coming. When his request to marry the Polish princess got shot down, he threw a fit. Elizabeth was already done with his nonsense. To snap Peter out of his delusions, she took him to the Peter and Paul fortress, where Russia locked up its most dangerous criminals. The moment Peter stepped inside, he was shaken to the core by the broken, tortured prisoners. For the first time, he was terrified of the woman he called Auntie, finally grasping that she was Empress first and foremost. If he kept pushing her buttons, he knew there'd be only one end for him: prison. His fears were confirmed when he saw Ivan VI, locked away alone and barely able to speak. Looking at the lost, innocent-eyed boy, Peter lost his bravado. He quickly switched to calling Elizabeth Your Majesty and groveled, saying, "I want to get married. Who do you think I should marry?" He passed out right after saying that. On the carriage ride back, Peter kept his eyes shut, pretending to sleep, but he overheard Elizabeth's plans by accident.
Слаб оказался Петр Федорович. И телом, и головой. Одна надежда, что ребенка родит. Ни на что более он не годен.
Once he has a son, ship the kid off. Hide him in a monastery or a jail. Knowing the Empress's whole plan, Peter was petrified. He realized the only way out was to stall having kids, by any means necessary. Meanwhile, Princess Sophia of Prussia, the bride handpicked by Empress Elizabeth, was on her way to the Winter Palace. Snow swirled all around as a beat-up carriage rumbled into view. Inside sat a woman who'd one day make all of Europe tremble. This was Catherine II, the only empress in Russian history to earn the title the Great. But right then, she was just a starry-eyed girl, clutching a Russian textbook, stumbling over words, and dreaming of a fairy tale romance. Hailing from far-off Prussia, she'd endured the bone-chilling cold and endless jolts of the journey. Her only comfort? Imagining that her future husband would be a dashing, responsible guy who'd love and respect her. The carriage, gliding smoothly over the snow, suddenly veered out of control and toppled over. Sophia and her mother went sprawling onto the ground. In that hot mess of a moment, a good-looking guy appeared out of thin air and reached out to help. Sophia was floored. She blurted out to her mom, "Mom, it's a prince." She mixed up the charming Duke Saltykov with Prince Peter. Love lit up her eyes before she even realized it. She thought she'd fallen head over heels at first sight. It wasn't until the Duke set the record straight that Sophia realized her mistake. Waves of disappointment and embarrassment washed over her. But Sophia quickly talked herself up. If the prince's aide was that suave, she figured, then Prince Peter had to be even more amazing. So she went right up to the Duke and asked for tips on winning the prince's heart. To her shock, he told her the real person she should butter up was Empress Elizabeth. Back in the carriage headed for the Winter Palace, Sophia's eyes filled with worry and confusion. The sharp-minded girl knew right away that the place she was headed was crawling with challenges and shady plots. Sure enough, they got the cold shoulder. Not only did they not get to meet the prince, but nobody even bothered to greet them. Worse, Sophia got dragged off alone to an empty room for a health check by the royal doc. They wouldn't let her and her mom see Empress Elizabeth and Prince Peter until they gave her the all-clear. But Sophia didn't notice the hesitation in the doctor's eyes as he scribbled down her health report. The fancy, gilded hall was packed with Russian nobles and officials, all craning their necks for a peek at the princess from overseas. Remembering the Duke's advice, Sophia plastered on her biggest, most sincere smile for Empress Elizabeth. She kissed the back of the Empress's outstretched hand respectfully, then stammered out a greeting in broken Russian.
Ты говоришь по-русски.
Без русского языка не сколотишь и сапога.
Sophia's eagerness to learn Russian won her a hearty laugh from the Empress. But being able to speak the language was just the tip of the iceberg for Russia's future princess. Empress Elizabeth told her intelligence guys to keep a 24/7 eye on Sophia and her mom, to make sure they were truly loyal to Russia. On top of that, she sent a young, good-looking painter to cozy up to Sophia's mom, hoping to get the real scoop on her motives. Sophia was so wrapped up in studying Russian, practicing for her big one-on-one with Prince Peter the next day, that she had no clue what was going on around her. All the while, shady plots were brewing in the shadows.
Король Людовик готов увеличить вам содержание. Вы можете найти у принцессы или телесную неразвитость? Нет.
Ristov might have been the Russian royal doctor, but he was French through and through. He was in cahoots with the French ambassador, doing all sorts of spy-like stuff to score points for France. When they were picking a bride for Peter, he pushed hard for a French princess. Now that the French-Russian marriage deal was falling apart, the ambassador came back to Ristov, telling him to find a way to torpedo Peter and Sophia's engagement. But Sophia was in great shape, and there was no way they could fudge her medical report. If the Empress called for a second opinion, they'd be toast. The ambassador didn't give up. He pulled out a fancy little bottle and handed it to Ristov, telling him to slip its contents into Sophia's food in 3 doses. Lured by King Louis's huge cash offer, Ristov took the bait. He tracked down the maid who looked after Sophia and used his charm to rope her into the scheme. With sweet talk and false promises of love, he got the maid to take the plunge, risking everything for a future together. Sophia, still lost in her own romantic daydreams, spent every free minute poring over Russian court etiquette and practicing her pronunciation. As she mimicked Peter the Great, the girl had no idea that danger was closing in. It was Sophia's first date with the prince, and she felt rather nervous. She practiced the expression and tone for greeting him over and over again in front of the mirror. Unlike her, who took it seriously and looked forward to it, the prince not only arrived late on purpose but also boldly claimed that when dealing with women, one should be as tough as when dealing with politics. This was his way of showing his dissatisfaction with this arranged marriage. The poor girl stood in the snow for a long time and finally waited for the belated prince. She greeted him warmly, but all she got in return was Peter's cold stare. Even so, Sophia still had a rosy view of this man who was about to be her husband, thinking that his strange behavior was full of personality. Meanwhile, the maid's plan was put into action. She noticed that Princess Sophia liked eating orange pudding. So, when no one was paying attention, she quietly took out the poison she had hidden beforehand from her chest and spilled it all into one of the cups of dessert. Then, with a calm expression, she served it on the princess's plate. The unsuspecting girl gracefully speared a large piece of pudding with her fork and took big bites, not stopping until she had finished the whole orange pudding. She really loved oranges, really loved Russia, and was even more full of anticipation for her future married life with the prince. Sophia danced excitedly in the corridor and was soon attracted by a sword on the display stand. She picked it up carefully and admired it. It turned out that this was the sword forged by Peter the Great himself before his expedition to Narva, which had extraordinary historical significance. Peter suddenly snatched the sword from her hand and waved it around like a naughty child. Elizabeth was startled by his recklessness and became even more dissatisfied with Peter as the heir. Her expression was filled with disappointment and anger. The attentive Sophia quickly noticed the Empress's unusual mood. Immediately, she praised Peter the Great sincerely in her still awkward Russian, and then smoothly complimented that the Empress could also be called the Great. The girl's inadvertently revealed ambition pleased Elizabeth, who was also full of political ambition. As long as Sophia and her mother could pass the Empress's loyalty test, her marriage to Peter was almost a certainty. However, as soon as Sophia returned to her residence, she bumped into a strange man coming out of her mother's room. Alarm bells went off in her heart, and she rushed in immediately. As expected, her mother was lying on the bed, disheveled. Sophia was shocked and angry. How could her mother betray her father? Didn't she love him anymore? Hearing this, her mother sneered and bluntly said that she had never loved her husband. She also warned Sophia not to have any expectations of love, for none of the women in their family had ever married for love. Sophia was deeply hurt. Since no one in the family had ever had a love marriage, then she would be the first. She didn't want to accept a marriage without love. But sometimes, it seemed that the family curse really existed. Early the next morning, Sophia stood with the others in front of the carriage to see the Empress off. However, her pale face soon caught everyone's attention. They whispered among themselves, thinking that the prince's fiancé had a hereditary family disease and wouldn't live long, just like her Uncle Karl 30 years ago. Sophia tried to ignore these unfriendly remarks. However, the faint discomfort in her body made her uneasy. But in public, she could only pretend that everything was normal. It wasn't until the Empress got into the carriage and left that Sophia couldn't hold back her cough. She quickly covered her mouth, trying to hide the abnormality, but the glaring red stain on her white glove made her dizzy. Sophia immediately bid farewell to Peter. Without even waiting for a reply, she turned around and walked eagerly towards the steps. Her body was getting heavier and heavier, and Sophia could hardly move her steps. But she still managed to make it back to her residence with incredible willpower. However, as soon as she sat down to rest, the prince's attendant brought an invitation to a hunting trip. Sophia had to pull herself together, gracefully wipe the blood seeping from the corner of her mouth, and find a decent excuse to send the attendant away. Then she closed the door, fell onto the bed, and lost consciousness completely. Sophia's mother was terrified. She kept slapping her daughter's cheeks, trying to wake her up, but to no avail. Worse still, the royal physician the maid had called was none other than Ristov, the man who had poisoned Sophia. Without almost any diagnosis, Ristov directly carried out bloodletting treatment. The princess's face turned pale at a visible speed, but the physician didn't stop. He even threatened to drain her bile as well. The Empress, who had just arrived at the monastery, also received a secret letter saying that Princess Sophia didn't have much time left. She was furious and immediately announced that she would return to the palace to take charge of the situation. To everyone's surprise, the girl woke up with her strong will to live. This made the physician uneasy. He immediately found the maid he was involved with and asked her to find a way to poison Sophia for the second time. Princess Sophia had to die. The crown princess of Russia could only be a princess from France.